Well, hello again. It's Steve Smith here once more, and this is my fifth CPD presentation on the topic of listening. And, I started off talking about phonology and phonics, and then we moved to lexical retrieval and parsing. And the last presentation I talked about interpersonal listening and generating words, chunks, and sentences during question-answer sessions, that kind of thing. And now, for the last one on listening, I'm going to move to task-based listening. And normally the sort of listening that one might do at a slightly higher level, but not always, and where the focus is on performing a particular task. So get your cup of tea or coffee and strap in for the next 15-20 minutes or so, and I'll give you a little bit of theory and also some practical classroom ideas. That's me, spsmith45 on Twitter, and that's frenchteacher.blogspot.com, and let me also mention informedlanguageteacher.com for readings and research about language teaching. Now, two of the key principles of acquisition, second language acquisition, are, and you've heard me use this phrase already, comprehensible input, associated most with Stephen Krashen. And a second one is the idea of interaction. So when you receive input, the opportunity to interact with it. And that idea is associated quite strongly with Mike Long here, who developed his interaction hypothesis. But all writers, I think, without exception, from research, say that we really acquire language best when we focus on and engage somehow with meaningful input, whether that be Krashen, Bill Van Patten down here, Mike Long, Rod Ellis, and writers like Lightbound and Spader. And all of these writers actually put a particular focus on tasks, and I want to tell you exactly what they mean by tasks in case this is new to you. Now, definition of a task, this comes from Rod Ellis. The 4 points are this. So the focus is on meaning, not on linguistic form. You need some sort of information gap, which creates a need to communicate between people, maybe the teacher and the class, or between members of the class. And that's a fundamental principle of the communicative language teaching approach. Usually with tasks, students rely on their existing knowledge, but they may get input from the materials being used. That's why many people feel that tasks work better with students who've got some language under their belts. And for a task, there needs to be a clearly defined outcome, some sort of goal to be achieved. So, a language teaching game can be a task where there's a specific goal and where the focus is on meaning. Some writers like to say that these tasks should have a real-life connection, the sort of things that we would do really. For example, if people were talking about planning a holiday together or talking about a movie to watch on Netflix, that could be a linguistic activity, but a real-life task. Now, to go back to the field model that I've shown you a number of times already, there are lots of processes involved in listening. When you're performing a task, you're probably engaging in all of these at some level, whether it be distinguishing sounds, syllables, words, syntax, intonation. So within the process approach, you could argue that tasks and interpersonal language teaching play a role. Now, for beginners who don't have so much language to make use of in their long-term memories, there are nevertheless tasks that you can do, and you may have tried these yourself. Certainly I got a fair bit of mileage with youngsters, let's say, who'd done a year or two of French, with opinion surveys, the sort of thing where students go around the class and ask their classmates, what their favourite subjects are, or their foods or hobbies, maybe what they did last weekend. And so an opinion survey does fulfill pretty much the criteria for being a task. There is an outcome involved, there's a purpose, and in this case you could present the data graphically, or you could report back the data to other classmates or to the teacher. So they're certainly the sort of activities at a simple level where the focus is on meaning, less on form. Now, here is an interesting task. Do you know the game show The Price is Right? It's the one where contestants have to guess the price of something. And to me, this is an example of a classroom language learning task which can be used at relatively low levels and through to higher levels as well. So in case you don't know on how it might operate in the classroom, it's something like this. I've given you the price of the house there, but in the case of the house I showed you there, you would describe the house to the class, use some basic vocabulary. You know, there are 3 rooms, there's a swimming pool in front of the house, there's a garden, there's a garage, all that sort of thing, some nice comprehensible language. You then invite, say, 4 students to the front of the class to make a guess at the price. And this is a good way of practicing numbers, of course. And then each of the 4 contestants at the front makes their best guess, and the student who gets closest to the real price, which in this case, as you can see, was 215,000 euros or so, is the winner. They stay up, and the other 3 students go back to sit down to be replaced by 3 more, and then you display your next picture. Houses are quite good for this because they offer a lot of opportunities for teacher description. Simple vocabulary, but you could use actual objects you brought into the classroom. You could get pictures of Amazon or similar sites using genuine prices. With more sophisticated students, you could use items that demand greater vocabulary in the description of the items and so on. But that's certainly a classroom winner. The Price is Right. Here's an example of another task. Like the other tasks I'm showing you here, they all appear in Breaking the Sound Barrier in Chapter 7 of that book. And this one's called Find Out About Your Teacher. Probably for intermediate students, let's say students who've done minimum 3 years, maybe 4 or 5. Takes about 40 minutes, and the focus is on personal identity, present and past tenses. So for this one, as a teacher, you'd probably want to prepare this in advance, think through or write down a talk about yourself. The language you use will depend on the class and how good they are, so you can tailor-make it to your class. And during your talk, you will probably want to build in, recycle structures, phrases that your class knows already so that the input is nice and comprehensible. If you're going to introduce some new things, do whatever you have to do to scaffold the language, to shelter the language, to make it comprehensible. You could even support it by showing PowerPoint pictures of your past life, for example. So, take it into account the fact that students will probably be quite interested in you, and that if you want your listening material to be motivational, this is likely to be more motivational than playing something from a textbook, let's say. So that's the idea, and then if we look at how it works, so you introduce the task, dictate some key language perhaps in advance to make sure that the students are activating some prior knowledge there. So in this case it might be phrases like my favourite pastimes, in the past, when I was young, and so on and so on. Students could transcribe that, which is actually good listening work in itself, good phonics practice and spelling practice, or you could simply display it on the board. But in any case, make sure the language is revealed on the board, and you could get students to repeat it chorally and individually. I mean, the amount of choral repetition will depend on the class. So if they're already quite skilled at pronouncing, then that wouldn't need too much work. If you think they need more practice, then do some choral repetition. But all this is just getting them, whetting their appetites for what's to follow. So you then might talk, let's say for 2 or 3 minutes, about yourself, and you're going to include that language that you put on the board. As I mentioned, you could display some photos. I would think of building in lots of repetition of high-frequency words and phrases. Use gestures, facial expressions, whatever it takes to make sure that the language is understood. If you want to put a twist into it, you could warn the class in advance. They've got to find 2 deliberate factual errors. I mean, these could be as obvious or as subtle as you want, depending on the class. You could say things that are quite absurd, or you could just put subtle things in where the students might, if they know you already, might guess, well, that sounds a little bit iffy. Now, as you talk, students could take notes. This could be either in the first or second language. Note-taking in the first language has the advantage that the task is focused on meaning. If you get them to use the target language, then they're having to think about transcription and form and written accuracy. I think probably for this sort of task, if you want it to be focused on meaning, notes in the first language would be absolutely fine. And that allows you to see that the students are taking notes as you're talking. So I'd give that talk a second or even third time, as long as it takes. And then in pairs, students can compare the notes they've taken and begin to plan how they're going to report back, this time in the second language, ideally. So you could tell them in this case that they've got to use the second person of the verb, the you form of the verb, which actually doesn't get that much practice in classes. It's quite difficult to generate activities where they have to use the formal version of you, whether it be vous or usted or whatever it might be. You could go around, monitor what they're doing, help with factual details, maybe scaffold some language on the board to help them put it together. I don't think the focus here would be on accuracy, it's more about communication. And then a spokesperson from the pair reports back orally, or reports to someone in another pair and so on. And this is a whole class activity. You could elicit information from students, write it up on the board, summarize it again. So overall, they will have heard this language many times, seen it written down, tried to write some of it down themselves. All that is hopefully producing some pretty good material for long-term memory, which is where we want the language to end up. And in this case, they could produce an end task, which is a written article about you. You could even share a photo with the class for them to use. Or maybe they could record from their notes and do a spoken report about you. I think there's a lot of mileage in that idea as a source of listening and as a task. Now this one here, called Ask and Move. Now this is borrowed from Nation and Newton, 2009, and probably one for intermediate or advanced level, this one. For those you teaching A-level in England, Wales or Northern Ireland, for example, where you have to study literature or film, this is quite, and subtopics, for example, which can get quite factual. This could work very well in that context, but actually, whatever your teaching context, this is a pretty good communicative task. So you write out 4 paragraphs on a topic. So the example I've given here is Berlin. Each of those 4 paragraphs, when combined, form a description of Berlin. You separately write and print off 12 questions about it. So what's the population of Berlin? What are the most popular places to visit? Etc., etc. Tell the class what's going on. 4 volunteers are going to be the experts on Berlin. They're going to place themselves somewhere around the room, and they're each going to have one of those first 4 paragraphs that you gave them. The rest of the class, if the class is big enough, can work in pairs, with each pair having a set of those 12 questions. If they can work in pairs, one partner is the scribe, the other is the seeker of information from the experts, and they could switch roles halfway through. If the class is smaller, well, maybe you can't work in pairs, but individuals could still carry out the task. So, of course, the information seekers here won't get all the information they need from one person alone. They've got to go and find all 4 people. So there'll be a situation where they ask one of their questions, and one of the experts doesn't know the answer, and they'll just have to say, I don't know, I don't have that information. And then they'll have to ask someone else, move around and ask another expert. Eventually, when they think they've got all the answers, then the pairs can discuss the written notes and prepare to feed back. And ultimately, the result of this task could be a written description of Berlin or an orally recorded version of Berlin. So that would be at a fairly advanced level, but you could use that at intermediate level as well, and it doesn't necessarily just have to be factual information. It could even be some sort of narrative text that's used. So it's one of those lessons where you'll have the students milling around quite a bit, using a lot of target language. Make sure you monitor that it is target language, and I think with all these cases, it's a question of can they handle it, can they do it successfully. If they end up sharing things in English all the time, then there's not much point to doing this sort of activity. So that's just a little taster of some of the tasks that we described in our book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, Teaching Language Learners How to Listen. And they were from chapter 7 of that book. And some extra reading for you there. If you want to read about task-based language learning and teaching, then there's Rod Ellis' book from 2003. And then a reference to Krashen's book, Principles and Practice, once more, which I mentioned in the last presentation. And Mike Long's book, Second Language Acquisition and Task-Based Language Teaching. And a mention for Notion and Newton there as well. Just while I'm giving you references, you may know already Gianfranco Conti's outstandingly good blog called The Language Gym. Gianfranco nearly always writes blogs which are informed by research and which give lots of classroom ideas, and you can select different categories including listening and see some of his very informative, sometimes controversial blogs about language teaching. So I thoroughly recommend Gianfranco's blog. In the next session we're going to be looking at grammar, so a slight change from the previous ones I've been doing with you, and a little plug for the 3 books I've been involved in: Breaking the Sound Barrier, The Language Teacher Toolkit, and Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher. Thank you very much for tuning in, everybody, and I hope you carry on listening to these sessions and find them useful in some way or another. Bye.